The war between humanity and the TSR had lasted for years. The TSR, an alien species known for their strength and advanced technology, had been relentless in their attacks. Human forces fought back with everything they had, but it felt like an endless battle. Captain Samuel Carter, a battle-hardened officer in the Earth Defense Fleet, had led many of those fights. He had lost friends, ships, and entire fleets to the TSR, and with every loss, his hatred for the alien species grew stronger. The humans thought they had a plan to end the war and a loud offensive to push the TSR back once and for all. But no one expected what happened after the battle on the fringes of the Korma system. The TSR fleet had been defeated, and it seemed like the war was finally over. But that was when the surprise came. Captain Carter received a message from the TSR princess herself. She had surrendered, but not in the way anyone expected. In the middle of a meeting with his senior officers, Samuel received a transmission. On the screen appeared a woman with pale green skin, her eyes glowing like twin stars. She wore a crown made of silver and a dark blue robe that looked ancient. "I am Princess Seraphine of the TSR," she announced, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I surrender to you, Captain Carter, but not in the way you might think." The crew around Samuel was silent, unsure of how to react. Samuel was confused, unsure whether this was a trap or if the TSR had finally reached their breaking point. His hand hovered over the communicator, ready to end the call, if needed. But before he could speak, Princess Seraphine continued. "I offer you a marriage proposal, Captain Carter," she said. "A political marriage between our two species, to end the war once and for all." Samuel stared at the screen. A marriage to his enemy? The idea seemed absurd, but Seraphine's words weren't empty. There was power in them. She wasn't just asking for a union of convenience. She was offering a solution that could bring peace to both species. Seraphine explained that her people had been manipulated for generations by forces beyond their control. Her father, the king, had been pressured into a war with the humans, not out of desire for conquest, but because of hidden interests. She believed that a marriage between the two of them could form an alliance, one strong enough to break free from the strings that had controlled her people for so long. Samuel, despite his deep distrust, found himself listening. His mind raced. The idea of marrying the enemy was hard to accept, but what other choice did he have? The war had caused too much destruction. Too many lives had been lost. Was this the way to end it? He turned to his officers. "What do you think?" he asked. There was hesitation, but some of them saw the logic. They had always known that war couldn't last forever. Peace treaty was necessary, and this might be the way to do it. The risks were high, but the reward of peace was worth it. "Take a deep breath, Captain," said Sarah, the ship's engineer. "This is uncharted territory, but maybe we can trust her. She's putting everything on the line. We should at least hear her out." With a heavy heart, Samuel agreed. He looked back at the screen where Seraphine waited patiently, her eyes filled with both determination and a strange kind of hope. "I accept your proposal, Princess Seraphine," Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But I warn you, trust doesn't come easily for us humans. You will need to prove your intentions." Seraphine smiled. "I understand, Captain, and I will, for both our people." The decision was made. Over the next few days, the details of the union were carefully discussed. There was resistance. Of course, Samuel's superiors were skeptical, and some of the TSR leaders saw this as an act of betrayal. But Seraphine remained firm, willing to face opposition from her own people to secure peace. Soon the day arrived when Samuel and Seraphine were to meet face to face. They stood before each other in a room aboard Samuel's ship. Samuel, in his military uniform, towered over Seraphine, who wore her regal attire. It was the first time they would meet in person, and the tension was palpable. Seraphine extended her hand, a gesture that was unfamiliar to her species, but one that had been suggested by human diplomats. Samuel hesitated for a moment, but then shook her hand firmly. Dud. The connection was immediate. There was something powerful in that simple touch. as though the weight of the galaxy itself had shifted. "Thank you for this, Captain Seraphine," said softly, her voice almost too gentle for someone who had led a war against humanity. "This is our chance to heal." Samuel didn't know if he believed her yet, but he knew one thing. The marriage had begun. What followed would change everything. He'd always thought of the Taser as his enemies, but now he had to learn to see them in a new light. The crew and the world watched as Samuel and Seraphine prepared for the ceremony that would bind them together. There were whispers, doubts, and even fear. But the one thing no one could deny was the weight of the moment. The marriage wasn't just about two people, it was about the future of two species, and perhaps the future of the galaxy itself. The ceremony was over, but the real challenge was just beginning. Captain Samuel Carter and Princess Seraphine, once enemies on opposite sides of a galactic war, were now bound together by a marriage neither had expected. The idea of peace seemed impossible to many, but here they were, trying to make it a reality. The days after the ceremony were filled with awkward silences and unsure conversations. Samuel had agreed to the marriage for the sake of peace, but the emotions inside him were complicated. How could he trust someone who represented everything he had fought against? How could he build a future with someone whose people had killed so many of his own? Seraphine, on the other hand, felt the weight of her decision every moment. She knew that her people had long been under the influence of powerful forces, and this marriage was her way of taking back control. She wasn't just marrying a human captain. She was joining two worlds that had been at war for far too long. But even with the political and personal stakes of the marriage, she found herself growing more conflicted with each passing day. It wasn't easy to bridge the gap between them. Samuel kept his distance both physically and emotionally. Seraphine understood, but that didn't make the silence any easier. As much as she respected Samuel's strength and courage, she felt a growing frustration at how closed off he seemed. She decided to try a different approach. One evening, after the daily meetings with their respective officers, Seraphine asked Samuel if he wanted to join her for a walk through the ship's garden, a space Samuel had never really visited. The idea of nature in the middle of a warship was still strange to him, but he agreed. There, among the trees and plants they had worked so hard to grow, they began to talk more openly. "So," Seraphine began, her voice softer than usual, "how do you feel about this? Marriage?" Samuel paused, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected the question so soon, but he knew it was coming. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It's strange. Everything I've been taught tells me to distrust you and your people. But you're not like the others, and that ... that confuses me." Seraphine smiled lightly. "I can understand that. For years, I was taught to see humans as nothing more than enemies. But when I met you, I saw something different. More than just a soldier, I think. I think we both have more in common than we realize." The words surprised Samuel. He had never really thought of himself as anything more than the captain of a ship. But Seraphine was right. There was more. To him, more to both of them. They were both leaders, both burdened with the responsibility of their people, and both caught in a war they hadn't started. "I don't trust easily," Samuel said, looking down at the ground as they walked. "But maybe I can start with you, maybe." Seraphine nodded. "I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know this is hard. But we're in this together now, whether we like it or not." They walked for a while, the silence between them comfortable for the first time. There was something about the garden, the trees, and the quiet night that made it easier to speak honestly. Samuel began to realize that while his anger toward the Taser was still there was also something else: curiosity, maybe even hope. The next few weeks passed in much the same way. Samuel and Seraphine spent more time together, though their conversations were often about strategy, peace talks, and the logistics of running a warship that was now a symbol of their unlikely alliance. Slowly, their bond began to grow, though it was far from perfect. Samuel still kept his distance, and Seraphine often found herself wondering if he would ever truly accept her as more than a political partner. One day, they were called to a meeting with their joint council of human and Taser leaders. Tensions were high as old enemies sat together at the table. Some of the humans in the room glared at Seraphine, still unsure about the marriage. The Taser representatives did not speak, but their cold stares made it clear that many of them saw her as weak for marrying the human enemy. The meeting began, and it didn't take long for the usual arguments to start. The human delegation demanded that Seraphine's people disarm their fleets, while the THR insisted that the humans provide resources to rebuild the THR's war-torn colonies. No matter how hard Seraphine tried to calm the room, the hostility between the factions was palpable. As the arguments grew louder, Samuel stood up. "Enough," he said, his voice firm. "This bickering will solve nothing. We've spent years fighting, and where has it gotten us? Nothing but destruction. We can't go back to the way things were." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was silent. Seraphine looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected him to speak up like that, but there was something in his voice, a determination that echoed her own. She stood beside him, her voice steady as she added, "We are more than our past mistakes. This is our chance to build something new." The council members looked at each other, unsure of what to say. But the seed of peace had been planted. The conversation shifted, slowly at first, and for the first time in years. Both sides began to consider the possibility of working together. After the meeting, Seraphine and Samuel walked away from the council room, both of them feeling the weight of the day's discussions. Samuel glanced at her, his expression softened. "You were right," he said quietly. "I didn't think it would be possible, but maybe... maybe we can do this together." Seraphine smiled. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. They weren't just fighting for peace anymore, they were beginning to build it. As they walked down the hall together, side by side, Samuel couldn't help but think that, despite everything, this might just be the beginning of something extraordinary. The journey ahead would not be easy, but with Seraphine by his side, he felt like they could face whatever came next. Together, they were no longer just enemies, they were partners, and that made all the difference. The fragile peace between humans and the TSR had begun to take shape, but not everyone was happy with the new alliance. The war had left deep scars, and there were still many who could not see past the hatred. For some, the idea of Captain Samuel Carter and Princess Seraphine being united, let alone working together, was nothing short of betrayal. Even within their own factions, whispers of rebellion and unrest began to grow louder. The Taser Council, though publicly supportive of the peace efforts, privately felt uneasy about Seraphine's decision to marry a human. They had always seen humans as enemies, and now their princess was aligned with one. The older members of the council were particularly vocal, suggesting that Seraphine's act of marrying Samuel was a sign of weakness. To them, the alliance was a political move that undermined their people's honor. On the human side, Samuel was no stranger to criticism. His fellow officers, some of whom had fought in the bloodiest battles against the Taser, were uneasy with his decision. The idea of trusting an alien, especially the princess of the enemy, made many uncomfortable. Some officers even muttered about betrayal, questioning whether Samuel had compromised his honor. He was still their captain, but a growing number of them felt he was losing touch with his people. The tension between Samuel and his crew began to grow, though he tried his best to ignore it. As much as Samuel wanted to focus on the bigger picture piece, cooperation and rebuilding, he knew the road would be harder than he imagined. The human forces were still divided, and the TSR were far from unified. He and Seraphine could not do this alone. They needed to gain the trust of both their people if their plan was ever going to succeed. One evening, after a tense meeting with his officers, Samuel found himself alone in his quarters, staring out at the stars through the large viewing window. He had always found comfort in the stars. It reminded him of home, of Earth. But tonight they seemed distant, cold, and unreachable. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion. It was then that he heard a soft knock at the door. He turned, surprised to see Seraphine standing there, her regal appearance softened by the quiet of the moment. She had become a regular presence in his life. Samuel wasn't used to seeing her without the weight of her royal title on her shoulders. "You're troubled," she said gently, stepping into the room. "I can feel it." Samuel sighed, turning back to the stars. I don't know if this is going to work, he admitted, his voice heavy. The people, Seraphine, they're not ready for this. They're not ready for us. Seraphine walked over to the window, standing beside him. I know, but we can't expect them to change overnight. It's not just you and me that are fighting this war. It's everyone we represent. We're both fighting years of hatred and fear. Samuel glanced at her, a little surprised by her. Words? You make it sound easy. I'm not saying it's easy, she replied, her voice firm but kind. I'm saying it's worth it. We have to believe in what we're doing. We need to show them that we believe in it too. For a moment, the two of them stood there in silence, watching the stars. Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Seraphine was right. They couldn't change the world overnight, but they could start with themselves. Their union was a symbol of hope, and they had to live up to it. But as they stood together, the sound of the door opening broke the quiet. A man in a Cheezer military uniform stepped into the room, his face hard and stern. He was one of the senior members of Seraphine's guard, and Samuel had met him only a few times before. Princess, the man said, bowing slightly. There's trouble. Seraphine turned quickly. What's happened? The council. They're moving against you. They say your marriage to the human is a betrayal to the TSR. They've called for a vote to strip you of your title and your authority. They want you to step down? Samuel's heart sank. He could see the pain in Seraphine's eyes, but she quickly masked it with a calm expression. I see, she said, her voice cold. A cue for the news. Please inform the council that I will. Speak with them in private. As the man left, Samuel turned to Seraphine. They can't do this. You're the princess. You're their leader. Seraphine shook her head, a sad smile on her face. Leadership has never been about titles, Samuel. It's about trust. And right now they don't trust me, but you've been fighting for peace. Samuel argued. You're the one who wants to end the war, to bring us together. You're not the enemy anymore. I know, she said quietly. But there are many who cannot see beyond the past. They believe that peace with humans is impossible, and I am seen as weak for trying to make it happen. Samuel stood tall, his jaw clenched. Then we show them that they're wrong. We fight for the peace we believe in. I'm not letting them tear this apart. Seraphine looked at him, her eyes softening. And I'm not letting them destroy what we've built either. But we cannot do this alone. We need your people to support us. Samuel nodded, his resolve growing stronger. Then I'll speak. To them, I'll make them understand. You're right. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone we represent. Together, they walked out of the room and headed to the council chambers. Samuel knew it wouldn't be easy to convince the humans or the TSR. But he was ready to fight for what he believed in. He wasn't fighting just for peace. He was fighting for Seraphine, for their future and for the future of their people. As they entered the chamber, the eyes of both the human and Sir representatives were upon them. The tension was thick, and Samuel could feel the weight of every stare. But he didn't back down. He stood beside Seraphine, ready to face whatever came next. This is not just a marriage, Samuel said, his voice steady. It's a symbol of unity. We don't stand together now, we risk losing everything. We've fought for too long, we've sacrificed too much. And I'm not going to let that be in vain. The room was silent. For a moment, it seemed like no one was willing to speak. But Samuel could see something in the eyes of the council members, something that hadn't been there before. Doubt, maybe, just maybe, were beginning to believe in the peace Seraphine had fought. The tension in the council chambers was palpable. Samuel stood beside Princess Seraphine, their presence commanding attention. The council of both humans and Caesar leaders sat in a tense silence, waiting for Samuel to speak. After the recent challenges, the peace process seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The pressure weighed heavily on everyone, but especially on Seraphine. She had been born into a world of power and responsibility. But even as a princess, she was not immune to the forces that threatened her people. The Kaiser Council had long been divided, with factions both supporting and opposing the marriage between her and Samuel. Today, they had called for a vote to strip her of her title, accusing her of betraying the Tsar by aligning with humanity. Samuel glanced at Seraphine, sensing her unease. He had come to understand the complexity of her situation. She wasn't just fighting for her own future. She was fighting for the future of her entire species. He stepped forward, taking the floor. We've all been through a lot. For years we've fought each other, and for what? To destroy our future? To continue this cycle of hatred and violence? He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of both humans and Zur. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know this. We can either choose to continue the war, or we can choose peace. And peace begins with us, here today. His words hung in the air, but the room remained silent. The teaser leaders exchanged wary glances, and some of the human representatives still looked unsure. Samuel could feel the weight of their skepticism, but he also felt a growing determination. The idea of peace was a fragile thing, and it needed all their support to survive. Princess Seraphine stepped forward beside him, her voice steady but filled with emotion. For far too long, we've been led by those who only see war as the answer. I am not one of those rulers. I have seen the destruction, I have lost my family, and I have watched my people suffer. This alliance with humanity is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of hope. Together, we can build something better. The room grew quiet as Seraphine's words resonated with some of the council members. But there were still those who refused to believe that peace was possible. A member of the Teaser Council, a tall and imposing figure named Raul, stood up, his voice sharp. You speak of peace, Princess, but your actions have proven otherwise. You've married a human. You've put us at the mercy of the very species we've been fighting for generations. How can you call this peace? Seraphine met Raul's gaze without flinching. I understand your anger, Raul, but peace is not built on hatred. It is built on understanding. I do not expect everyone to agree with me, but I do expect you to listen. We cannot continue down this path of endless war. Samuel stepped forward, his voice firm. We have fought for too long. Our people have lost too much, but we can make this work. We must. We are stronger together. It's not just about us anymore. It's about the future of our species. We are more than our past mistakes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one by one, several members of the council stood up. First, a human representative named Admiral Harris, who had been skeptical of the peace effort from the start, spoke. I've seen the damage that this war has caused. I've seen the strength in Seraphine's vision. If we are truly committed to ending this war, we must support her. The TZR council members exchanged uncertain glances, but slowly, one by one, they began to nod in agreement. Raul, the one who had been the most vocal in his opposition, hesitated, but then spoke, his voice low. I do not like this, but perhaps it is time for a change. If we continue to oppose this marriage, we risk losing everything. After a tense silence, the vote was called. It was a difficult decision, and the results weren't unanimous, but in the end, the council decided to support Seraphine's marriage to Samuel. The path to peace was far from certain, but for the first time in years, there was hope. As the meeting ended, Samuel and Seraphine left the council chambers together. The weight of the moment was heavy, but there was a sense of relief, too. Had won the vote, but the real challenge was just beginning. Samuel turned to Seraphine as they walked down the hall. That was close, he said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and relief. But we did it. We're one step closer. Seraphine smiled, though it was a tired smile. One step closer, yes. But there is still much work to be done. The peace we've begun to build is fragile, and there will be those who will try to tear it down. Samuel nodded. I know. We've come this far. I believe we can do it. Seraphine stopped walking for a moment and looked at him. I never imagined I would be here, fighting for peace with the very species I once saw as enemies. And yet, here we are, working together to build something that might one day bring true peace to the galaxy. Samuel smiled at her. I never imagined I'd be standing beside an alien princess either. But I'm starting to believe in this. I'm starting to believe in us. They continued walking, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, they felt like they had a chance, a real chance, at making their dream of peace a reality. The air was thick with anticipation as Captain Samuel Carter and Princess Seraphine stood at the edge of a new chapter. The Tizer and human forces had finally agreed to meet for the first time in a summit where they would discuss the future in. Uncertain future that rested on the fragile peace they had forged together. The journey to get to this point had been long and difficult, but now, the possibility of a united galaxy seemed within reach. As they prepared for the summit, Seraphine felt a mix of hope and fear. She had fought her whole life for peace, but there were still so many unknowns. The war had scarred her people deeply, and there were factions within the TSR that still saw humans as their enemies. Samuel had seen the same doubts within his own people. He knew that this was no ordinary peace talk. It was a test of trust, a test of courage. "This isn't going to be easy, is it?" Samuel asked, his voice breaking the silence as they walked toward the summit hall. Seraphine shook her head. "No, but nothing worth having ever is." Samuel gave her a small smile. "I've fought for peace in battles, but I've never fought for peace like this." Seraphine met his eyes. "And you're not alone in this. We're in this together. Every step of the way." Yes. As they entered the summit hall, they were greeted by a sea of unfamiliar faces. The representatives from both sides sat at a long table. The tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Some of the humans looked wary. Others openly stared at Seraphine as if they couldn't believe she had chosen to marry Samuel, their sworn enemy. The Tezer delegation, while mostly silent, also seemed on edge. Their eyes were not just on Seraphine, but on the humans as well. The first speaker, a Tezer Council member named Gil, stood up. He was tall, with a broad frame, and his voice was sharp as he spoke. "Princess Seraphine," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "You have betrayed your people by aligning with these humans. How can we trust them? How can we trust you?" The word struck hard, and the room fell silent. Samuel could feel the tension building, but Seraphine stood tall beside him. She didn't flinch. "I understand your anger, Gwel," she said. "But I ask you to look at the reality of our situation. The war has torn us apart, has destroyed families, and killed too many. We can keep fighting, or we can build something better. This marriage, this union between humans and Jazer, is not just a political decision. It is a commitment to peace." Gal's eyes narrowed, and he looked to the human representatives. "And you, humans, what do you want from us? Do you expect to gain from this alliance?" Before anyone could answer, Samuel spoke up. "What we want is simple: peace. For too long, we've fought and we've lost too much.
Ow.
Our people are tired of war, just as yours are. If we can't put an end to this, then we're all doomed to a future of endless fighting. We've seen what happens when we choose destruction. We can't go back to that." Seraphine added, "We want to build a future where both of our people can thrive. Together." The room was still, no one daring to speak. Samuel could see the doubt in the eyes of both sides. It was clear that the path to peace was not going to be smooth, but it had to start somewhere. And today, it would start with them. As the summit continued, the discussion grew more heated. Arguments broke out over resources, land, and the terms of peace. Dazar delegates demanded reparations, while the human representatives wanted assurance that the Dazar wouldn't turn on them again. But amidst the chaos, Samuel and Seraphine remained calm, guiding the conversation back to the heart of the issue: peace. "We need a common goal," Samuel said, his voice steady. "Something we can all agree on. Need to rebuild together. No more fighting, no more distrust." Seraphine nodded. "We've both lost too much. It's time to build a future, not just for us, but for those who come after us." Slowly, the mood in the room began to shift. Some of the delegates nodded in agreement, while others still held reservations. but the seeds of cooperation had been planted. Samuel and Seraphine's united front was enough to convince some that peace was not just a dream, but something worth striving for. As the summit came to a close, Samuel and Seraphine exchanged a look. They had done what they could, but the real work was just beginning. Their people were still divided, and it would take time to heal the wounds of war. But this was a start, a solid foundation to build on. Later that night, after the summit had ended, Samuel and Seraphine stood outside. Overlooking the stars, the sky seemed endless, and for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew that they had taken a crucial step toward something better. "We're amazing today," Samuel said, his voice soft as he looked at Seraphine. She smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you. We make a good team." Samuel nodded. "We do. And we'll keep fighting for this peace no matter how hard it gets." Seraphine's gaze turned to the stars. "The road ahead won't be easy, but I believe in us. I believe in what we can do together." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the stars that stretched out before them. Were no longer enemies. They were allies. And together, they would continue to fight for a future of peace and hope, no matter the obstacles they faced. The days after the summit were a mix of uncertainty and cautious hope. The peace process had begun, but it was far from secure. Both humans and Dzar had made small steps toward understanding one another, but there were still many who held on to the old ways, who saw the other side as nothing more than the enemy. However, Samuel and Seraphine had achieved what many thought impossible. They had laid the first stones of a bridge between two warring civilizations. For the first time in years, there was a sense of possibility, a sense that peace, though fragile, was not just a dream. It had been a week since the summit. And Samuel stood at the command center of the human fleet, overlooking the stars. He was lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had happened. Despite the progress, he knew there was still much work to be done. The forces against peace were strong, and he could feel the tension in the air whenever he spoke with his fellow officers. They had been trained for war, not diplomacy. They had been taught to fight, not trust. "Captain," a voice called out, breaking his reverie. It was Sarah, the ship's engineer. "You've got a message from Seraphine. She said it's urgent." Samuel's heart quickened. Seraphine had been under pressure from her own people. The marriage had given hope to some. It had also made her a target for others within the Chezzer leadership. He turned and followed Sarah to the communication room, where the screen flickered to life, revealing Seraphine's face. "Samuel," she said, her voice tight with tension. "We have a problem." Samuel's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "There's been an attack," Seraphine replied. "Some of the hardliners within the Chizar faction have taken matters into their own hands. They've sabotaged several of our peacekeeping efforts, and now they're planning a full-scale assault on human colonies." Samuel's stomach sank. He had feared something like this would happen. The war had run so deep in the veins of both sides. Peace was a threat to some, not a promise. "How bad is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's bad," Seraphine answered. "I'm calling for your help. We need to show them that we won't back down. We need to unite our forces to stop them before they can cause any more damage." Samuel nodded, determination building within him. He knew what needed to be done. This was not just about fighting a battle. It was about proving that peace was stronger than war. "We'll be there. I'll have the fleet ready in 20 minutes. The message ended, and Samuel quickly made his way to the bridge. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. He had to act, not just for the safety of his people, but for the future he and Seraphine were trying to build. He couldn't let the extremists on either side destroy everything they had worked for. As the fleet gathered and prepared for battle, Samuel felt Seraphine's presence in his mind. Though they were far apart, the bond they had forged in there struggle for peace seemed to guide him. She was with him in spirit, even if not physically. Together they had come so far, and Samuel knew that this battle, this final test, would prove that their alliance was stronger than any force that sought to destroy it. Hours later, The human and Jezzer forces stood side by side, facing the rebels who had sought to undo the fragile peace. The rebel fleet was large, and the battle was fierce. But Samuel and Seraphine's united front was stronger. The human and Chaser ships fought with precision, working together in a way they never had before. It wasn't just strategy that won this fight. It was trust. The trust that had slowly built between their two people. As the last rebel ships were neutralized, Samuel stood on the bridge, his eyes scanning the stars. His heart was still racing, but there was a feeling of relief. They had won this battle. But more importantly, they had proven that their people could work together, side by side. To fight for a common goal, the victory was celebrated, but it wasn't the end of the road. There would be more battles, more obstacles to overcome, but Samuel knew they were no longer fighting alone. Together with Seraphine and their united forces, they could build something lasting. Later that evening, Samuel received another message from Seraphine. This time her face was full of relief, though there was still a hint of exhaustion in her eyes. "We did it," she said, her voice softer than before. "The rebels have been defeated. But this victory is only the beginning." Samuel smiled. "I know. We've come this far, and we'll keep going. Together." Seraphine's eyes shone with a quiet hope. "Shh. You've made me believe in this, Samuel. You've made me believe in us." Samuel's heart swelled as he looked at her image on the screen. "And you've made me believe in something bigger than just the war. We're not just fighting for peace anymore. We're fighting for our future." As the message ended, Samuel stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of her words. They had fought for so long, and now, for the first time, it felt like they were on the verge of something real, something permanent. The next few months were not without their challenges. But Samuel and Seraphine's alliance grew stronger. Together, they led the efforts to rebuild what had been lost in the war. They helped establish new trade routes between human and Xur colonies, bringing prosperity to both sides. Slowly, trust was rebuilt, and the galaxy began to change. At the heart of it all were Samuel and Seraphine. Their bond, once seen as a political tool, had transformed into something far more powerful. They had proven that even in the darkest of times, love and trust could forge a future of peace. And as they stood together, looking out at the stars once more, they knew that they had achieved what no one had believed possible. They had created a new world, one where enemies had become allies. Hope had replaced fear. The future was theirs to shape, and they would do it together.